Brisbane is not just one of the largest, but one of the fastest growing markets in Australia right now. With the 2032 Olympic Games coming up, a monster undersupply of available property for rent, a complete population boom post-COVID, and a statewide undersupply from the building perspective, Brisbane is one market to keep your eye on in 2025, which is why in today's video, I wanted to share 20 of the top reasons to invest in Brisbane based on my experience of having bought over $550 million worth of investment property for myself and my clients in Brisbane over the last 10 years. Now, every single one of the 20 reasons today is an absolute gold nugget. And if you bear with me, I'm going to talk about some of the longer term history and some of the amazing things coming up in Brisbane in the next few years. Now, I think it's important to look at our history in Australia before we kick off the Brisbane market. And between 1972 and 2022, according to Simon Priestley, one of Australia's top analysts, Australian house prices were one of the top performing assets in the world, growing by an average of 8.2% per annum. Now, when we look at another data source from homely.com, when we look at the period between 1976 and 2016, so that 50-year period in Brisbane, and we look at the total return divided by the number of years, Brisbane grew on average by a phenomenal 9.7%, which is super interesting because over the same period, Sydney grew by 9.6%, Melbourne grew by 9.5%, and Perth grew by about 8.2%. Now, the reason that's important is because we want to be investing in markets with a long-term history of growth, and obviously Brisbane has shown us that in many, many occasions over the last 50 to 100 years. Now, in terms of considering what to buy in Brisbane, because it's not just one city, obviously, there's the north, the south, the eastern beachside suburbs and the western suburbs, as well as central Brisbane. And then within that, there's really high quality pockets, cheaper pockets that you want to avoid. There's houses that have absolutely, or suburbs that have absolutely boomed in price over the last 10 years, and other suburbs that have massively underperformed. Again, using history as our guide, between 1992 and 2022, so a 30-year period, according to CoreLogic, houses outperformed units in Australia by over 125%. So if you're looking to buy Brisbane, definitely focus on those houses or the townhouses with a larger piece of land. Now, what's absolutely crazy, over that same 30-year period between 92 and 2022, house prices in Brisbane went up a whopping 340%. I can't believe I just said whopping. Now, obviously, since the start of COVID and then with the living memory of the last GFC, people have been pretty frightened over the last sort of 5 to 10 years to invest in product that's outside of Sydney and Melbourne. But what I found through Simon Priestley's work and Commonwealth Bank's work is that between 1972 and 2022, so that 50-year period, there's actually only been 1 year in Australia where every single capital market declined in the same year at the same time. So Australia is a very, very diversified property market that is a little bit different from the American and the European banking systems that allow a lot more leverage and a lot more lack of financial security and management within their banking system. Now, the reason I gave you that history in relation to those first 5 reasons that kind of had nothing to do with Brisbane was just to show you that the long-term history of high quality assets in Australia has been relatively stable. And of course, there's going to be bumps and bruises. Of course, you're not going to always be able to pick the perfect property, the perfect market, the perfect suburb on everything that you buy in the first year you buy it. But looking forward between now and the 2032 Olympic Games, there's 15 more reasons why I think Brisbane has incredible potential and time to shine. Now, this is where I really start to geek out personally. According to a number of recent articles in the Australian Financial Review, and if you simply Google Australian Financial Review plus Brisbane plus Olympics, you'll find a ton of articles with all sorts of different analysts and economists speculating on what they think is going to come in Brisbane. Now, I will say that none of us and none of them have an idea in reality, but they're forecasting some pretty crazy stuff. Now, a number of articles that came out in 2022 said that between that period and the Olympic Games, house prices could potentially double in Brisbane. Now, another article that just came out from KPMG, one of Australia's top consultancy firms and data analysts, was basically suggesting that house prices in Brisbane between now and the end of 2026, early 2027, could go up on average by over $280,000 to $320,000. Now, obviously, I'm a massive fan of data, and I'm sorry to be boring you with this stuff, but I hope you're as passionate about it as me, because we want to make data-backed investment decisions when we're moving into a market, especially one that isn't in our backyard. But between 1997 and 2003, so that period around the 2000 Olympic Games in Sydney, house prices, obviously because of the Olympics, but obviously because of a whole number of other reasons as well, went up by 97%. Now, another reason I like Brisbane at the moment is, according to a recent KPMG report, the 2032 Olympic Games is going to create around about 120,000 new jobs. Now, some of these jobs have already kicked off and are things like more infrastructure, more roads, better rail, stadium upgrades, but there'll be a whole bunch of obviously games related things as well in the tourism space, in the services space, in the hospitality space, and all of the physical people and volunteers we're going to need for the games as well. On top of this, they went on to say that they reckon the games is going to deliver about $8.5 billion of direct benefit to the Queensland and Australian economy. Now, why this is so important, this massive injection of cash that wouldn't be coming without the Olympic Games, is the Queensland government is preparing on bringing on over 50 years worth of infrastructure into the next 8, in the hope that those billions of dollars that come into the economy pay back obviously the loans through revenue and taxes for all of the money that they're dropping down on these infrastructure works at the moment. Now, another reason I love the east coast of Australia at the moment, and particularly Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne, is that according to the ABS, 75% of Australia's future job, income and population growth, as well as infrastructure growth, is going to occur basically between the Sunshine Coast in Queensland and the Mornington Peninsula in Melbourne. But particularly Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane are going to get the lion's share of the benefits of those. And we know from looking around the world that the populated cities with the great infrastructure, the great access to lifestyle and jobs are generally the ones that spike in value over time. Now, one of my favorite things as an investor in Brisbane at the moment is the chronic undersupply of available property for rent, which has resulted in a city-wide vacancy rate at the moment, according to SQM research, of about 1.1% to 1.2%. But there are many, many suburbs in Brisbane that we've been buying in the last 10 years that have vacancy rates sitting at below half of 1% right now, which means it is chronically undersupplied, and that's putting monster pressure on rental demand as well as rental rises, which is why we've seen some of the strongest rental growth in Australia post-COVID in Brisbane. Now, obviously, population growth is a part of the long-term property-related puzzle. There's not always a direct correlation between growing population and property price gains, or even infrastructure and property price gains on a citywide level. But according to the ABS, Brisbane's looking to go to somewhere between 4.2 and 5 million people over the next 30 to 40 years, which would mean the city is the current size of Sydney or Melbourne at the moment, and that would be a fantastic thing, particularly for inner city and beachside property in Brisbane. As that population spiked, we get a higher concentration of wealthy people living in certain districts, and like we've seen on the beaches and the eastern parts of Sydney and Melbourne, as well as the inner cities, when those people congregate together, prices blow up long term. Now, one of the strongest gold nuggets I've found recently, which is a really, really strong driver of long-term potential in a market, is according to the Australian Property Investor magazine or website and Michael Matusik, Brisbane or Southeast Queensland is currently short about 40,000 dwellings per year, or we need to create 40,000 dwellings per year, which we're nowhere close to that at the moment. So Michael Matusik, who's one of Brisbane's great data analysts, went on to say that even if we were to create the current number of dwellings for the next 10 years, we're going to be about 10 to 12,500 dwellings short per annum, which obviously again puts pressures on vacancy rates going down and the market continuing to be undersupplied, which puts more competition on places for rent as well as resale and drives the market up, which is probably one of the reasons why we're seeing prices in Brisbane over the last 12 months growing by as much as 14 to 15%, and the predictions for the new year to be somewhere between 5 and 8% in 2025, depending on which which data source you go looking for that information from. Now, I grew up in Sydney, down near Cronulla, but not at Cronulla, inland from there. And I saw when I moved up to Queensland for the first time in 2006, at that time there was about 1,000 to 2,000 people per week moving up into southeast Queensland, which created a monster amount of demand, obviously for property and rental dwellings at that time as well. Now, according to the ABS, over the 3 years ending 2023, Queensland's population has been growing extremely strongly, and it was the #1 destination for internal migration in Australia. And it kind of makes sense post-COVID. We all have heard about obviously hundreds of thousands of people leaving Melbourne and Sydney and those markets where some of those lockdowns were pretty rough, moving to Queensland, the Gold Coast, Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast for that greater flexibility, freedom and lifestyle, as well as the sunshine that this beautiful state offers people. Now, another reason I love Brisbane at the moment for 2025 and beyond as we lead up to the games is the massive surge in jobs and the undersupply of particularly trade-related workers in Brisbane. So we've seen a monster surge in the Olympic-related work and the citywide work. I was down there a couple of weeks ago. There's cranes everywhere, and there's some major projects that I'll talk about in a moment. According to the Australian Financial Review, Brisbane now has the highest average trade rate per hour in Australia. That was a bit of a mouthful to get through at over $100 per hour. One of my friends is a very, very senior plumber that works on like the big casinos, hotels, hospitals, university projects around Australia, as sort of first, second in charge on those sort of sites. And he said at the moment, all of the big companies have been calling out everyone like him to get them up to Brisbane because this is the next big run in terms of those projects over the next 7 to 8 years. Now, what I'm noticing on the ground up here as someone who's buying anywhere between 2 and 5 properties every single week in Brisbane at the moment with my team here at Pumped On Property. Just so you guys know, we're a buyer's agent that's been working on this market up here for the last 10 years. We've worked with over 1,000 people to help them enter Brisbane now and bought over $550 million. But we're noticing in the quality and affordable parts of the city, so near the CBD, on the beaches in north, south and southwest Brisbane, really good quality houses or townhouses, and now selling in sort of 1 to about 4 days from the date that they're gone online. So I know that demand in Sydney has dropped off massively and Melbourne at the moment, but properties, especially affordable ones that are in that sub-$1 million range, are moving that quick at the moment. We're seeing that week in, week out, regardless of the time of the year. Now, like I was sort of saying a minute ago, the amount of infrastructure going into Brisbane is insane. In fact, one of the biggest infrastructure projects that we've seen in Queensland's history was just approved in the media in the last 6 weeks, and that's the $5 billion train line, effectively redevelopment / expansion, which goes from Brisbane all the way through to the Sunshine Coast for the first time. I think it's going to go into Caloundra there, which will be great. And then there'll be some light rail like they've put in the Gold Coast recently, which will go from Caloundra to Mooloolaba to Maroochydore and longer term, maybe as far as Coolum North. So phenomenal piece of infrastructure. It's going to employ a lot of people from what we've seen based on history. If you can get into those areas where the new train lines are going to be opening up sort of 2-3 years before they open up or during the start of the construction schedule for those sorts of things, we generally see a fairly decent spike in asset prices. Infrastructure is a key driver of speculation, and speculation is a key driver of property price growth. On top of the train line there that I was talking about, for the first time in Brisbane's history, they're digging underneath the city like they did in Sydney a long time ago, the Cross Harbour Tunnel, I think it was called, or something like that. I remember as a kid trying to hold my breath through that tunnel and having absolutely no success at it as I drove through it. But in terms of Brisbane, the underground metro, which will be a series of train lines, I think 8 or 9 new stops throughout the city there. There's also so much going on from a roads perspective, towards the Sunshine Coast from Brisbane or towards the Gold Coast from Brisbane. They're going from sort of 2 lanes each way to 3 to 6 lanes each way on the M1, which is a phenomenal project at the moment. On top of that, we've got hospitals being rebuilt or built, schools being rebuilt everywhere, universities being redone, huge amounts of high-rise residential stuff going in there. We're going to have the Olympic Village going in there as well in Hamilton and other parts of the city. Just very, very exciting, the amount of work's going on in Brisbane at the moment. Now, I think the last thing or the final thing that I wanted to add in terms of why I like the idea of 2025 at the moment for Brisbane and a handful of other markets in Australia is it's looking like, according to the RBA, if you just go to their latest press release on their website, that their intention now that they've sort of got inflation almost under control and that America, England, New Zealand and Canada have all reduced their rates, some of them as much as 2 times in the last few months, is that we're going to start to see some easing in the interest rates in Australia to take some of the pressure off people like me and you that either own our own homes or investment properties around the country. It's very, very exciting. Based on long-term history, what we've seen from CBA is that when we see a 1% rate cut for a period of 12 to 18 months, generally we see a surge in house prices countrywide of about 15% if they hold those rates low. We are getting closer and closer to the next GFC style event. So it's absolutely not about rushing into Brisbane and just buying anything. And like 5 years ago, hoping that it lifts all of the boats at the same time. From looking at about 415 suburbs across about 30 key performance indicators each, I found that there's about 45 to 60 suburbs which represent phenomenal value at the moment, very low vacancy rates, great incomes, high percentage of mums and dads living there, and most importantly, lower than average 10-year growth rates, which means that certain parts of Brisbane are fully priced in at the moment since the last GFC, growing by somewhere between 120 and 150%. And what I love about this city is directly next to those suburbs or close to them, there's suburbs that in the same period of time have only grown 50 to 70%, which means there's massive amounts of upside if you know where to find it in Brisbane. But I just wanted to round out by saying I'm super excited about Brisbane in 2025 and leading into the 2032 Olympic Games. Obviously, there's going to be heaps of different ideas that people have out there about which market to invest in which year. But Brisbane's fundamentals look extremely strong at the moment. And it's one of those markets where whether you're looking for an affordable townhouse, an affordable home, phenomenal cash flow, a duplex site, or simply a really blue chip inner city or beachside longer term hold, the city has all of those options available at the moment. And we just wish you all the best on your journey to entering the Brisbane market, whether that's for your own home or an investment property in 2025. If you're thinking about buying an investment property in the next 3 months, then the team and I over here at Pumped on Property would love to offer you a free one-on-one strategy session. To book your session, all you have to do is jump over to www.pumpedonproperty.com and click that free strategy session button. Now, in that session, we'll talk about exactly where you are right now, where you'd like to be longer term, and educate you on the current state of the Australian property market. And then you can take that information with a grain of salt and go and absolutely smash it on your own, or potentially become one of the small number of clients that we choose to work with each week. But either way, we wish you all the best on your journey to financial clarity, financial peace, and financial freedom.